The first time she ever asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up, I said a cook, and she yelled at me. The fact that this book exists in Korean is kind of miraculous to me. Opportunity to show the complexity of my life experience and my thinking. Hello, Korean readers. My name is Grace M. Cho. I'm the author of Tastes Like War. This is a memoir that I spent maybe 10 years or almost 12 years working on. It began immediately after my mother passed away suddenly. All of these memories of my childhood came back to me. And so this is, I describe it as partly a food memoir, partly a sociological study of the social roots of schizophrenia. Because when I was 15, my mother developed the symptoms of what Western psychiatry calls schizophrenia. And I then spent my entire adult life really trying to understand the context of her life, because I never really believed that it was just a biological illness. She never wanted me to cook as a child. The first time she ever asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up, I said a cook. And she yelled at me and she said, no, you can be a doctor, a lawyer, or a professor. I ended up becoming a professor, and she tried to keep me out of the kitchen for as long as possible as a child. But during the last years of her illness, she could no longer cook for herself. So I started to cook for her. Eventually, she started to ask for Korean foods. And that's how I learned to cook Korean food, and especially the foods that my grandmother used to cook for her. And so it's also sort of a story about searching for the past and discovering family history. It was 13 years ago that I last came to Korea. I've only been here since last night, so I haven't really had a chance to explore to see if things are different than the last time. But what's really different, what feels different for me, is that I brought my child with me this time. And so that was the main reason behind my trip back here, because I want my child to understand where I was born, where its grandmother comes from. And so it feels really special to me to be here. And so it just so happens that it coincides with the release of the book. So I get to do both this interview and show him my family history a little bit. So much of my experience of Korea has been about feeling that many things are inaccessible to me because of the language barrier, and that I have never really been able to explain who I am or what my story is when I meet Korean people here, or even to my relatives who are not that fluent in English. There's always been a barrier. So the fact that this book exists in Korean is kind of miraculous to me, because it's my opportunity to show the complexity of my life experience and my thinking. For the Korean edition, it's so different. Yeah, it's really beautiful. I love it. And it does, I think the two different covers really capture my mom's experience in Korea and in the US. You know, because I think that this one really was supposed to evoke the forests where she foraged, with like a little bit of the imprint of the war that's still sort of there in that experience. Whereas this one that shows a US camp town, this one represents the Korea that I never knew, but that my mother, tried to escape. And so I think that this one is it's very appropriate for this edition. The top is an image of forest in Washington State where I grew up, but the orange, the way that it is tinted orange sort of looks kind of warlike and smoky, it's a little bit apocalyptic. So yeah, I like it a lot, and it's just really incredible how they look so different, and even though it's the same content, they communicate really different things. Yeah, so in the prologue, I explained that I think of the book as being in three parts, sort of talking about three different mothers that I had throughout my lifetime. And the first was the mother of my childhood, and the second was the mother who was really sort of, incapacitated by her illness. And then the third mother was the mother of my 30s, turned into someone else once I started to cook Korean food for her, and our relationship really changed. And that's the mother also who gave me permission to investigate the past and to study Korean history, her history in Korea rather. And so the challenges were sort of putting those pieces together and really, looking at the more difficult aspects of my mother's life, her working in Kijicheon, for example, to look at it with bravery, I guess, not being afraid of what people would think. But a lot of it is nerve-wracking when you put a story out there, especially one in which you're so vulnerable, and which contain aspects of it that are stigmatizing, some people think are too shameful to speak. Miakguk, because that is the food that I most associate with my childhood. Miakguk for me for breakfast in kindergarten, because she knew how much I loved it. If she gave me a breakfast that I really liked, then I would wake up on time and get to, it was easier to go to school on time. And so I've always associated that with nurturing and care. Another favorite food from the book is kongguksu. I never had at any Korean restaurant in the United States. I live in New York now. There are a lot of Korean restaurants. I'd never seen that even on a menu. But my mom taught me how to make it when she was living with me and I was cooking Korean food for her. And so that's also something I associate with my relationship with her. And I've only ever had it here, aside from the kongguksu that I made. And then the third would be bibimbap. Just because I love rice. You can put anything in it to make bibimbap. When I was growing up, my mom's version of it was very simple. It was usually just a couple of ingredients, and she called that bibimbap. And then the first time I had it in a restaurant where there's all kinds of things piled on it, it looked very unfamiliar. But then I realized you can make bibimbap with almost anything. So I love it for that reason. Yeah, so for the academic book, I was expected to do a lot of research for that and to make a theoretical argument. And so I was writing it for a particular audience in mind, a much more limited audience, although I did try to be very creative with that and also include the personal aspect of it. But with the memoir, it was almost sort of the reverse, that it was a personal story that then I added scholarship to. And so it was more like the proportion of personal story to research, flipped, it reversed for the memoir. Yeah, so from my first book, I used this concept from two Hungarian psychoanalysts who worked with the children of Holocaust survivors. And they had this idea called transgenerational haunting, meaning that the secrets of one generation, because they're not spoken, if the trauma is unspoken, it gets passed down to the next generation. And it's around the secret, the things that we cannot speak, that those become ghosts in the unconscious. And so that's how I'd sort of developed this idea that the past of these women, when you have to hide the past, working in Kijicheon is too shameful to speak, then it becomes a kind of haunting. And so that's sort of how I started to imagine my mother as a ghost, a ghostly presence in my life and in my unconscious. Yeah, I'm interested in researching more about the work that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has done here in Korea around civilian massacres, in particular in Gyeongsang province. So that's probably going to be one of my next areas of research, but also comparing that to the way that the United States created a narrative of the Korean War as a good war, which sort of erases all of those episodes of violence. So that's one thing that I'm thinking about working on. And my other area of interest is related to the way that mental illness is criminalized, particularly in the US, that often people who have mental illnesses have a lot more interactions with the police because we don't have adequate mental health care. And so there's a kind of structural violence around mental illness there. Yeah, want to say I hope you read with an open mind and an open heart. A lot of my readers in the US say that one of their takeaways is that they see a lot of love that I had for my mother, and I hope that you also see that. And you know, I think that my goal, one of my goals, is to really portray people who have been rejected from society as fully human, and that's my hope with this book. Mom, just think that the next time I see you, it'll be spring, I said, and then it will be cheeseburger season.